Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Princeton University Press Ideas Podcast, a joint production of Princeton University Press and the New Books Network. I'm Mark Clovis, and today I'm speaking with Peter K. Andersson, author of the book Fool, In Search of Henry VIII's Closest Man. Peter, welcome to the New Books Network.
Thank you very much.
I was wondering if you could start us off by telling our listeners something about yourself.
Sure. I'm a senior lecturer in history based at Örebro University in Sweden. I live and work in Sweden, but I've spent almost all my career as a historian studying British history. And I've mainly worked on the Victorian period. But now with the book that we're going to talk about, I've changed focus and I'm moving into the Renaissance and the early modern period.
That shift in focus is one of the things that I thought was absolutely fascinating about your book. What led you to focus upon this man of the 16th century, and what led you to undertake this incredibly challenging effort to write a biography about him?
I've always been interested in this kind of people, the outsiders of history, the little people, to use a bad term, really. Individuals who are marginalized or who live quite a humble life, or who in some way happen to stumble into the corridors of power, as in this case. Will Sommer, who my book is about, was a humble individual from a humble background, but he happened to become court fool and the cherished fool of Henry VIII, and he sort of illustrates how history can sometimes affect ordinary people in strange ways. And I think by looking at a man like him, I've looked at other people in the past of the same type. We can see the past through different eyes, and we can perhaps acquire a bit more of recognition when we study history.
And that gets to part of the adventure, I thought, of your book in terms of reading it, which was how you lay out the detective process, if you will, of trying to uncover this ordinary person, a person for whom we have nothing in his own words directly. We have no real contemporary biography of him or anything like that. And your book, as much as it describes his life and times, is about the process of discovering who he is. And I was wondering if you could begin explaining that to us by talking about the legacy that he left for his contemporaries, because you begin, as you describe in your book, you're approaching him by a series of by kind of going in through a series of concentric circles. If you could explain a bit how the immediate literary record he left, the immediate, shall we say, imprint that he's left, and what this reveals about who he was and why he matters.
Yes. Well, the thing is that Will Sommer, or Will Somers, as he was called after his death, was a very famous person in Shakespeare's time, in the late 16th, early 17th century. And he was famous as a sort of legendary comedian. He was invoked whenever comic writers wanted to sort of summon the spirits of the big humorists of the past. And then you sort of mentioned the name of Will Somers, the Henry VIII's fool, and he was famous for being a funny guy. But this was a myth that evolved after his death, quite quickly after his death, I think. And this myth, I think, has very much affected how people have written about him since then. Even in modern research, he is sometimes described as this sort of legendary comic. But I wanted to go into who he really was and to try and find sources from his own time, which there aren't that much of. So the sort of the biography of him becomes also the process of writing about him. and the process of discovery, who this man really was, and how his own surroundings viewed him, so to speak. So I try to sort of gradually peel off layers, layer by layer, beginning in this posthumous myth, which is very well documented, and you can find it in the works of Shakespeare and Thomas Nash and Samuel Rowley and so on. But then as you gradually move backwards in time, you see that this myth doesn't have that much to do with the reality. And in fact, he was probably quite a different man, who lived quite a different life from the one that the myth holds. So that sort of process, moving from the posthumous myth into the real person, I thought was very much part of an important part of presenting who he was, really.
You also present him in the context of his role at court. And so you have a chapter where you describe him as part of this category of people at court that were there in the, in that period, which were fools. Could you perhaps explain a bit, who the fools were? Because now the word has a certain connotation today that is similar, but not the same as it was back then. Who were the fools at these courts, and what purpose did they play, and how maybe do we misunderstand those people in modern times?
The court fool, or the fool in general, was, fools could be quite a sort of heterogeneous category of people, really. People who were deemed disabled, intellectually disabled, in the sort of early modern definition of how medical definitions and legal definitions of these things and so on. But then there were household fools and court fools. Not all fools were employed by kings or monarchs. Some fools were employed by just prominent individuals or aristocrats. Thomas More had a fool, for instance. And it was quite a sort of vogue for employing fools, especially in the 16th century and the time of the Renaissance. And you could speak about two kinds of fools when you spoke about professional fools. There were natural fools and there were artificial fools. The artificial fools were people who were, comedians, people who were skilled at making jokes, making wry comments at dinner parties and so on. These types of fools probably weren't that common if we go back to the 15th, 16th century. What was more common then was probably the other category, the natural fool, which was basically a person mostly with what we would nowadays call an intellectual disability, who was employed as a fool because of that, and because people found his demeanor, his behavior, and the way he spoke both amusing, but also in a way symbolic, maybe with a sort of hidden meaning, something like that. So these people were cherished in a way, and they were employed, but they were also sort of kept. They were treated as something in between a human and a pet, you might say. So sometimes you can find traces of them being quite maltreated and quite viciously treated. For instance, it was generally seen that you should chastise them in the way you did with wayward children. So the lot of the Renaissance fool was not an easy one, you might say, and it wasn't really the sort of Shakespearean fool that you see in plays from that era, the smart wry comics who have what some people call the fool's license, the way fools could sort of speak the truth to the king and say things that other people weren't allowed to say and so on. It wasn't really like that. That's more of a myth that sort of emerges later on, especially in fiction.
That was another dimension of your book that for me was really illuminating, which was how we're seeing not just his role, but we're seeing these attitudes towards disability, where you have these people who, by virtue of their disability, have this very special place in the presence of the halls of power, and yet there's no tolerance. And I mean, we describe disciplining. You're not talking about sending them to their room without supper. You describe in there how Will Sommer and others are beaten and physically punished for something that we don't know necessarily what they were punished for, but given the fact that they did possess disabilities or were differently abled, was not exactly something that we could expect that was under their control.
No, exactly. I mean, it's. I mean, of course, we react when we read about how they were treated in this period, and the sort of the general idea of the attitude towards disability in this period is something that we think is horrible. Obviously, John Haywood, who was a contemporary of Will Sommer, describes the lot of the fool in one of his plays. And he has a famous list that one of his characters say, some beat him, some fob him, some joll him, some job him, some tug him by the arse, some lug him by the ears, some spit at him, some spurn him, some toss him, some turn him. It's a very long sort of list, which ends with not even Will Sommer, the king's own fool, can avoid this sort of punishment. So yeah, that was probably very much how it was. But then when you go through his life, and when you compare it to other fools in the same period, you see that there was also a different side to it. There was also a lot of compassion and sympathy. Courtiers and diplomats refer to Will Sommer in their letters and are concerned for his well-being. There are tales of Will Sommer having a tendency to fall asleep in odd places, and courtiers or servants would come up and put a pillow under his head, things like that. So it was quite a complex relationship towards this. It was intolerant in a way, of course, but it was also there were other dimensions to it, which certainly doesn't sort of excuse the chastisement and so on, but definitely makes it worthwhile to look more closely at this and see, and you would sort of uncover quite a complex view of these things.
I'd like to turn now to Sommer himself and your examination of his life in the book. Could you start by talking a bit about his background? From where did Sommer come, and how did he come to be at court?
He first appears at court sometime in the 1530s. The first records of him in the court are from about that time. And we don't really know how he came to be a court fool. There are tales that were told after his death about his origins. One of the most credible is that he would have been employed by a wealthy merchant called Richard Fermer, who lived in Northamptonshire at a large estate. But this Richard Fermer was convicted of treason by Henry VIII. And at that point, Will Sommer would then presumably have been moved to court. And also part of this story is that this Richard Fermer was eventually pardoned on the king's deathbed through the appeal made by Will Sommer. So that, meaning that Will Sommer would in that case have been loyal to his original master throughout his life, and made him restored him to his wealth ultimately. But this is a story that is told really a century and a half after Will Sommer's death. So is it true or not? There are no other records of it. And it's very difficult to see if this is true. I mean, Richard Fermer did exist, and he had a manor in Northamptonshire and so on, but there are no records of him employing Will Sommer. So it's quite difficult to get a sense of exactly where he came from. We can see how other fools were recruited There was a lot of what you might call talent scouting going on when different courtiers or officials connected to the court were traveling around the country. Sometimes they would write letters back to the court saying, "Oh, we saw this fool in this village, and he might be suitable for employment at the court," and so on. So possibly this is also how Will Sommer came to be at court. Maybe he was, sort of discovered by someone and taken to the king. But yeah, it's you can speculate a lot, but basically we know very little about his background.
And that gets to something that you address in some detail in your book, which is his presence in the historical record. And one of the things I enjoyed about your book is that it's a well-illustrated book. And that gets to something that really makes Will Sommer very different from many other people more famous, more powerful than him, which is that we have a visual record of him. Yeah. And I thought it was fascinating the way that you glean out his presence in the records. You find where he is and how you can take these scraps of information and combine it with the physical record to give us a sense of him that we actually don't have for most people who lived at that time.
Exactly. It's quite interesting that there are several contemporary portraits of him. Some are probably later copies of works that would have been painted during his lifetime, but it's quite you can actually get quite a clear image of what he looked like, and he appears especially in sort of dynastic family portraits of the family of Henry VIII and his children. So and he regularly sort of stands somewhere in the background. He's not he's not your typical funny comedian. He doesn't wear the cap and bells and things like that. He's standing in the background in the shadows, quite a brooding figure, looking very serious, wearing dark clothes. You wouldn't think that this is actually the court fool. You would think that this is some sort of a clergyman or something. But actually, this is what he looked like, and he seems to have been. It seems to have been very popular to include him in these types of portrait, and maybe he was there as a sort of good luck charm, as a sort of mascot of the Tudor court, because it's strange to see how often he crops up, and of course this is interesting because we have, as you said, we have noblemen and women whom there are no portraits preserved of. So the relationship between these is quite interesting. If we look internationally, you can find quite a lot of fool portraits or portraits of court dwarfs and so on. So I think that was a bit a part of the appeal of a fool or a court dwarf, that they had a sort of visuality to them that people wanted to preserve or wanted to document in a way. So maybe there was more of an incentive to make portraits of them than there was of other people.
And this visible record, you is part of the sources that you draw upon, including, say, records of, say, transportation, records of victualling, supplying, and how they give a sense as to a person who, was very much, present at court at a lot of times. I was wondering if you perhaps talk a bit about what all of this reveals about Will Sommer at court and the type of foolery that in which he engaged, because you explained, not all fools were equal, and some of them were noted more for certain things than others. Where did Sommer fit in that spectrum?
The piecing together, the image of who he was and what he was like, you have to try and draw conclusions out of a very, very fragmented picture. You can find his name in all sorts of places, but there's never a very consistent record of him or of his life. Mostly you can find him in the wardrobe accounts where clothes are being ordered for him. You can find him in the Master of the Rebels accounts, where the man who was responsible for entertainments and so on. But strangely, he's not that visible in records relating to entertainment. He's not listed together with musicians or minstrels or things like that in the court records, and that's quite interesting, I think. But because it sort of indicates that the fool was viewed as something else. The fool was not viewed as something especially related to regular entertainment or music or just fooling around. I mean, the fool was something different. So he sort of sits in between and crops up now and then, sometimes, in relation to his horse or something like that. But then the most interesting record of him is probably when courtiers and prominent people of the period refer to things he said, and that's you can find in letters, but also in published pamphlets and things like that, where someone probably wants to sort of signal how close they are to the court of Henry VIII by quoting his fool and by saying, oh, it's like that time when Will Summer said that thing, and so on. And these sayings are a bit, they're not what you'd expect. They're not just jokes or anecdotes or anything like that. They're usually in the form of gaffes, times when he's seems to have sort of put his foot in his mouth and said something that is sort of inadvertently funny. And that is, of course, quite revealing of what kind of fool he was.
So what would you say then, having studied the records, having looked at his posthumous reputation, and as you point out, the fact that he is very much present today in all sorts of historical novels and biographies that examine the time, what would you say Will Sommers' legacy was in terms of his role at court and why he matters to us today?
He matters because his type of comedy. The medieval or the Renaissance fool was not a sort of prototype stand-up comedian. There is no sort of connection in that way. But there is a different connection in that the type of comedy that he symbolized and that continued after him is a sort of taste for comedy that is inadvertent and that is natural, a sort of penchant for comics who do not laugh at their own jokes, and a sort of taste for deadpan comedy, you might say, or more subtle comedy. And I think this is something that you can sort of trace back to this period, because how men like him are described and what was funny about them is in many times connected to this type of modern comedy, which you can find described in similar ways, really.
Well, we appreciate the time you've taken to speak with us. But before we go, could you tell us what you're working on now?
I'm trying to sort of develop various projects, both in the modern history and the Renaissance. But right now, I'm writing a book about dandies.
Fascinating. Do you find that there is a certain level of a certain degree to which that studying the courts in the 16th century helps to inform that in the more modern era?
In a way, but I think the most sort of the parallel that is most apparent to me is that dandies were also seen as fools in their time. So that sort of attitude is quite revealing.
Well, I look forward to reading that book when it comes out, and hopefully we can have you back on the podcast to discuss it.
Oh yes, that would be great.
Peter, thank you very much for taking some time out of your schedule to speak with us. Hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.